Who are you?
I spent most of my career as a transplant doctor.
How addictive the highs of the gratitude are of saving somebody's life.
We could save a patient in the morning and then lose one in the afternoon.
There's a very, very strong presence of female characters in this book.
All the characters in my book are based on real people that I saw in the hospital.
Where you could be president for an hour.
You cannot let insurance companies dictate the treatment that your doctor gives you. The most devastating part of my transplant experience is
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Dr. David Weill. Dr. David Weill is a former transplant surgeon turned author. His first book, Exhale, was his memoir, and his newest book, All That Really Matters, is a novel, his first fiction book, and it chronicles the journey of Joe Bosco, an arrogant transplant surgeon who basically gets addicted to the experience of saving lives and all of the ramifications that come with that by trying to fill kind of an empty void and ultimately finding that unsatisfying and turning himself over to find the things that actually matter in this life. Dr. David and I have a really, really cool conversation. We'd go all over the place from how he would change the healthcare system to the benefits and differences in writing nonfiction versus fiction, his own writing routine, and the real power that comes with fiction writing, the things that you can say and the impact you can make with fiction that you can't do with nonfiction. This is an absolutely fantastic conversation, and he was a pleasure to get to know. We even chat a little bit about his inexperience with video games at the very end of the episode. So without further ado, here is Getting to Know Dr. David Weil. Who are you?
I'm a husband and a father.
Beautiful. And what's your name for the audience?
David Weill.
Awesome, David. And David, I have you on the show because I just finished reading your wonderful book. I should start that over. All That Really Matters, right? Yeah. And it's great to have you on the show because I just finished reading your book, All That Really Matters. This is your first book in fiction, and you have had quite an interesting journey from going from med school, obviously, to becoming a transplant surgeon, to then writing memoir, to now writing your first fiction book. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that journey and what that has been like for you.
Yeah, I spent most of my career, and thank you again for having me on the show.
My pleasure.
I spent most of my career as a transplant doctor, as you mentioned, and I ran the Stanford transplant program for the majority of my career. And while I was looking at, what I wanted to do with my second act, I basically saw all of this stuff in the hospital, and I always felt like I wanted to share that with other people. I often walked around the hospital with, by myself and basically wanted to turn around to somebody and say, are you getting all of this? And what I do with my writing is try to bring the reader into the same situations that I saw, the same personal interactions I had with patients when they're facing life and death, the same team dynamics that we had while we were trying to provide this care. And so all of my writing is really directed at bringing the reader into that situation.
Was there a particular reason that was important to you?
It was important to me because I thought about it so much. In other words, even in real time, while I was actually doing the job, I thought about the weightiness of it and the responsibility that I had. And I also was incredibly impressed with the people that I treated, the courageousness of people that are facing life and death. I can't overstate that. And also the lessons they taught me. So, what I wanted to do really after watching this for 25 years is try to share all of that I learned with the reader. And that was important to me. It not only helped me in terms of I wanted to share it, but it also helped me process really what I had gone through during that long period in the hospital.
Yeah. What were some of the things that you gone through in that long period?
It just the roller coaster of it. There were high highs and low lows. We could
Mhm.
save a patient in the morning and then lose one in the afternoon and then have to do a transplant that night. And,
Mm.
the constant having to reset your emotional balance, if you will, to try to keep going, was
Sure.
an important lesson. The discipline of it, the commitment that it required but also working with a team of people. I mean, at Stanford, my team was 60 people, and
Wow.
you have to try to get all of those people to pull in the same direction, which isn't that easy. And most of the time we did that, and some of the
Hmm.
time we did not do that. And I write about
Hmm.
both, actually. And I think that the lessons, though, that I got from the patients were, don't sweat the small stuff. We've got life and death situations that are staring us in the face. And when I asked patients about what was most important to them, they did not talk about, their work or how much money they had or the success that they had achieved. They really talked about the interpersonal relationships that they had with their family and friends, and often their faith. And so I took that to heart and figured maybe I should live my life that way. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. How has that been for you to actually kind of not just think about that shift or know that in the back of your mind, but to kind of consciously make that decision? Like, has that had the effect that you intended, or is it you're still trying to find your sea legs in a new space? What's that been like for you?
It's been wonderful because I think I spent a lot of my life, and maybe some of your listeners did too, have too, not really examining what's going on with me. I
Mm,
spent most of it as a transplant doctor, and again, a big team of people, and I had to show up for work every day and keep moving, and did not have a lot of time to examine what was going on. And I've spent the last handful of years really trying to figure out all of what's happened. And I think it's helped me. I think it's helped me professionally in what I'm doing now, but it's also helped me in the relationships that I have, both with family and friends.
mm. You talked about in another interview that you kind of just find yourself in transplant, right? Because of the way that the medical, I guess, education system is set up, right? You choose a major or a specialty very early on in the process, and then you're there and you're on this roller coaster and you're doing all these things. But like to your point, you haven't really necessarily sat with what do you really want? And you also haven't had the experience to kind of figure out, you can't test a bunch of different specialties, it sounds like, in the medical field and then kind of figure it out later. So I'm curious if you were to kind of go back to your college experience and like start over with sort of the wisdom that you have now, would you still have chosen transplant? Would there have been a different field that you would have gone into? Would you have gone into writing just from the get-go? Like what would you have done?
I don't think I would have chosen a different specialty. I mean, transplant was actually a perfect vehicle for me.
Mm,
It provided a lot of moral and ethical decision making that I value a lot in my life. I also, and then this is me personally, and not to disparage other doctors, I need a life and death situation in order to motivate me in the
mm,
maximal way. So I never really had trouble getting out of bed because I know what was at stake. There are a lot of medical specialties where life and death isn't in the balance, and that's great. I mean, a
mm,
lot of my friends are in those specialties, and I think it's fantastic. It just probably wouldn't have been right for me. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and I
yeah.
think that transplant fit my personality really well. So I don't think I would choose any different medical specialty. To your question though about writing, I don't know that I could have or should have written anything in my 20s and 30s and maybe even my
Mm,
40s, because I'm not sure that I had figured out what I had to say at that point, and I hadn't had the experiences that I've had now that I can reflect upon.
yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like for you, you weren't able to have the insight, or a lot of the insight that you have now has come from that transplant experience of going through the highs, the ups and downs, the being forced to make really challenging ethical decisions of people's actual lives. And that's, given you a space to actually, like you said, say something with your writing and have something to give, which I think is a beautiful thing to share, because I think so many people in my generation and in I would say Gen Z, there's a lot of this like pressure. I feel like a lot of people find their passion or like do this thing that they love, and I think often one of the things that I've learned is that trying things or just having the experience of life will lead you to those things over time. But they like I think we kind of expect to just have all of our or whatever immediately, right? Versus like allowing the trials and the tribulations that we are in to shape us and really kind of trust our own journey.
I couldn't agree more with you. I really couldn't. I think that that really is how it evolves. I mean, I look at my transplant career. Yeah, I help people live longer, and I get that, and I value that. But it was also an education. You know, it was part of my education. It wasn't just college, medical school, residency. The education came from doing this work, and it's helped inform the way I think about life. And it was that meaningful to me. It wasn't, well, it was a job, and I did the job, and we helped some people, and that was about it. It's really informed the way I think about a lot of different things. And to your point, I think, and I have daughters that are entering the workforce, and I think that I try to tell them, do the work, and then let the lessons and whatever else come with that. Don't
Mm-hmm.
be so concerned about getting all of it right now. And I think that's hard for young people just generally, no matter
Mm-hmm.
what
Yeah, it's
generation.
yeah, we want to know all the answers. We want to know the shortcuts. We want to get there
Yep.
fast, right?
Yeah.
And that's definitely the lesson of, I think, patience. Um, One piece you mentioned was your education, both as being a transplant doctor, and obviously it's a very unique thing. At least I haven't seen this too often, where you wrote a fictional character who did exactly what you did,
Mhm.
as far as a career. Very different paths, it seems like. And I was curious, like, in what ways do your and Joe's paths align, and then at what ways do they diverge within your story and personal life?
Yeah, there's certainly some parallels, between myself and my main character, Joe Bosco. I think that there's more uh, dissimilarities than similarities, and I'm grateful for that because Joe is a little bit rough around the edges. I think.
Yeah.
I put Joe in New Orleans for certain parts of his life, and I grew up in New Orleans, so I guess that's a parallel.
Mhm.
I like to ride my bike, so did he. There's parallels, but when I went right, he went left, and when he went left, I went right. He made very different decisions than I did during the course of my career, so I don't see much in his journey that paralleled mine.
Hmm.
Um, I did know the world that he lived in because I lived in it as well. And in fact, all the characters in my book, his included, are based on real people that I saw in the hospital environment.
Hmm.
So, the story is not science fiction; it's fiction, and these are real life situations that we encounter in the hospital. But it was something that I made up in a fictional setting so that I could tell the story, I think, more completely than I could have in nonfiction.
Yeah. How did you do that with regard to writing about an experience that you haven't had but have maybe seen on the outside? Because I think one of the things that you did really, really well with your writing is capture what it's like to be in Joe's shoes, to really feel things from his perspective and not just, the way that I might see a character like that, right? It was a very human understanding, and it's very first person point of view perspective with that. And you really capture, for example, like the cocaine like addiction he has to transplant. Like I feel that when I'm reading the writing of how addictive the highs of the gratitude are, of the saving somebody's life, of being this hero, especially kind of filling the void that was left by his father, right?
You
So like
got
how did you get to that level of depth in someone else that you aren't personally?
Well, I think that like a lot of things, we can do whatever activity in moderation, and it's very healthy and great, like exercise. If we do it excessively, it's not great. Joe's issue about transplant is he really bought into the intoxicating part of it. And I felt some of that during the course of
Mhm.
my career. I just didn't take it to the extent that he did and get into trouble because of it. But I definitely got a taste of that. I mean, when, and I'll be honest, and it's going to sound egomaniacal, but I'll say it anyway. When somebody tells you that you saved their life, it's actually pretty nice. I mean, it feels
Yeah.
good, you know. And I was told that a lot during the course of my career, and it feels really good. If you start looking at yourself in the mirror like you're infallible because of it, or you can do whatever the hell you want because of it, that's a problem. And did I see some of those kinds of people? Did I work with those kinds of people in the hospital? I did. I did. So it wasn't that difficult, I don't think, to be able to imagine what happened to this character.
Were there any moments in your own personal life or journey that where you feel like you could have become Joe had you taken a slightly different choice or a different direction?
Sure, I definitely think so. I think, all of us that have family can count on that family to keep us grounded. I'm married to a very strong, very amazing person, and she really has been able during the course of my career to keep my feet on the ground. And I think that that's really important because, yeah, I could see all of what happened to Joe happened to me as well. It didn't, but I could see it happening. It's possible. It's conceivable. But I think it's really influenced. We're all influenced by the people right around us. And I think Joe had, the character of his girlfriend, Kate, he had somebody that was trying to keep him on the ground, but she was only partly successful at that.
Mhm.
But he didn't have anybody else to really do that.
Yeah. That kind of pivots into a question I had about the book. And one of the things I noticed was there's a very, very strong presence of female characters in this book. You write a lot of varied female characters, and they're really the predominant voices in this book outside of Joe's. Beyond that, right, there's his father, I think, and the priest, which are the only two real like other kind of male voices in that book. And I was wondering, was that something you did intentionally? Was that something that just kind of came through the writing? And why is that the case in this book in this story?
I did do it intentionally, and I did it intentionally because people like Joe that are in the position he is in the hospital often have a lot of female influences. A lot of people that
Mm-hmm.
work in the hospital are female. His nurse was an important um, part of this story. His assistant was an important part of this story. His girlfriend was an important part of this story. Also, a doctor. His mother was important in the story. Um, all of those people end up, I think, especially with women's ability to touch emotions better than I think we do as men. For a variety of reasons, whether it's nature or nurture, I don't know. But I think all of those people tried to keep Joe relatively sane, while he was doing this kind of work. And that was intentional because I think that actually really does happen in real life with people like Joe.
And was there anything about the I want to say the who Joe is as a person that kind of either doesn't get close with other men, do you feel like, as well? Because that was something that I kind of noticed as well, was not just the increase in the female voices, but also kind of the absence of other men. There wasn't a lot of strong male friendships that he necessarily had. Maybe that's because of the co-working conditions, but I was wondering, was there anything about Joe or that type of personality that you see that with as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of men, especially in his position, feel competitive with other men. And so they're usually looked at as foes rather than friends. And I saw that a lot in the hospital, where, men, especially kind of that, kind of macho man, um, will clash with their male counterparts, but get along perfectly well with their female ones. I saw a lot of that in the
Hmm.
hospital. And I wanted, and thought about having more kind of men characters around Joe, but his main male role model was his father, and that it didn't go as well. And
Yeah.
so he gravitated toward women. He looked at women as the people that he could most relate to, and I think a lot of it was derived from the relationship with his father, which was strained, I think, to say the least.
Yeah. And to the opposite too, right? Like the relationship with his mother is very nurturing and very
That's
caring,
exactly
right?
right.
He's kind of allowed to let down his A+ performance card and just kind of read a book and talk with his mom about it versus being graded for it.
Yes, when Joe was in trouble, he went to the female characters in the book for emotional support.
Hmm. Yeah. What was your own relationship with your father like and your mother like? Was it similar, relatable in any way, or?
No, it really wasn't.
Okay, fair enough.
Again, there's these basic, very superficial similarities. My father was German and a
Hmm.
Holocaust survivor. And
Hmm.
then when you compare my father to Peter Bosco, Joe's father, the similarities stop right there. Uh,
Fair
so
enough.
my father and I were very close. Was he German in every way? Yes. And did he have
Mm,
high expectations for me? Absolutely. But he was not nearly the pain in the behind that Joe's father was. And he and I got along really well. And he died about, 11 years ago now. And I really miss him. But we had a good relationship.
okay, well, it's good to hear that it doesn't parallel your life in
No,
that way,
no.
for sure. Um, I guess one of the things I noticed in your acknowledgments is you kind of mentioned that with your father, that it's like, you inspired a lot of the characters in this book, but only the really best parts, like none of the negative stuff, right? And one of the other acknowledgments that you had was actually acknowledgement to writing itself. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how has writing been a part of your, I guess, post uh, doctoral journey, if you will?
Yeah, when I got out of the hospital, I had a lot on my mind, and I think I was struggling for my identity in a lot of ways because a lot of my identity was wrapped up in being a transplant doctor. I'd been one for a long time, and when I looked in the mirror in the mornings, that's what I saw mostly. I used writing as a way to calm my mind in a lot of ways, to process what I was going through. And even though writing's difficult, for me, it never feels like work. It feels like I'm I'm doing some kind of therapy in a way, and not therapy in the way that I'm, working something out on the page necessarily, but I'm quieting my mind, and writing requires that, a quiet mind, a certain focus. And after years of running around the hospital with my hair on fire, I really welcome that. And so I wanted to acknowledge that in this book, how important writing has been to me. It's a love affair I have, similar to the one I had with transplant. You know, I even though transplant was rough at times, I didn't ever get mad at it. I love it. I really do. And I feel the same way about writing.
Was there a moment for you as you started to write after, for yourself, I guess, that you started to shift to like, oh, I want to write something for other people, like whether it's sharing your memoir, like what was that transition like in your own process of going, this isn't just for me anymore. I want to actually put this out there to help others.
Yeah, I started writing probably in a journal 10 or 12 years ago, and I always thought it was going to be just for me. I never really thought I was going to publish a book, but my first book was made up of all those journal entries about what
Hmm.
was going on, at Stanford in the hospital. And I certainly never figured that was going to be the case. I write these books, and I'm working, on another one right now, in the hope that just like when I read a book, or you do, I'm sure, there's going to be some message that stays with me. And I'm trying to do that with the writing. And I was interested in using fiction this time to deliver some of the messages, I think, more deeply than I did even when I wrote nonfiction about some topics that were similar-ish. I wanted to go more deeply with it, and I feel like I was, and a little bit surprised by this, that fiction really allowed me to explore things and say things even more directly than I had with nonfiction, which
Hmm.
I guess one would think, you can tell the truth and say it really directly with nonfiction. But I was impressed with how fiction allows you to go into spaces that you might not have done with nonfiction.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? What were some of the things you were able to say with fiction that you felt like you couldn't say with nonfiction?
I felt like I could call out the healthcare system a little bit more profoundly, and I did that in
Mhm.
the novel. I think also I could show the forces that are working on the people that take care of you and I in the hospital. And I could show what's going on behind the scenes when they come out to take care of us and how important all of that stuff is to the person that you're trusting to do the right thing for you. And sometimes they're able to do the right thing and sometimes they're not. And I felt like in the novel I could really get into those issues, quite deeply. And I also, wanted to talk about, what do mental health problems, substance abuse issues say in people like my main character? What do they look like? What does it feel like? And if I could do that, then I feel like I succeeded, you know. And I guess that's in the eye of the beholder, the reader, to determine that.
Yeah, well, I think you did a great job of that. I mean, I think one of the things that was very harrowing and eye opening was a lot of the stuff that you mentioned about being behind the curtain of this industry. And it's an industry you obviously personally love very much and care about. And yet there are these things, at least in the story, right, where there are pressures from capitalism, from different people in the system, from bad actors who don't have people's best interests at heart, or um, ways that people kind of jump the line in transplant because they're willing to drop a boatload of cash from overseas or whatever that might be. That really gets in the way. I was curious about that. Were all the things that you depicted things that you have either seen or experienced in some format before, or is any of that like, I guess, just fiction for fiction's sake, or were those all kind of real examples that you've seen in one way, shape, or form?
They're all real. I mean,
Wow.
so the things that I write about, were not just let me make something up and totally implausible and wow, that could never happen.
Hmm.
All of the things I write about actually do happen. Whether they happen all in one hospital or not is another matter. But, in my experience, I worked both inside of hospitals and now I work as a consultant to various other hospital systems and transplant programs. I've seen all of this,
Hmm.
and I fictionalized it for, reasons that I didn't want to offend anybody personally and I didn't want to offend a specific institution. But
Yeah.
all of that stuff really happens. I didn't have to make any of that up.
Yeah. Is there, I guess, what do we do about that, or what can we do about that to kind of help change the healthcare system? Because I know it's a big passion on your own heart of taking care of people over profits and this kind of thing, and it is this very complex system that we're in, right? Where you, even directly as a transplant surgeon, often are responsible for choosing maybe who gets to live in a particular situation, right? And it can be someone who maybe is the president of a corporation versus just some person who's living on the street or has a drug addiction or something of that in the past. Like how do we make better processes and more ethical decisions when there are so many complex variables in a situation like this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one, unfortunately, I don't have all the answers for, but I can tell you this. I think on the micro level, the decisions that I can make as a transplant doctor and the people in the field can make, we can actually influence that. We can get people, and this is part of what I do right now, get people to make better choices individually. What's more difficult is the macro level, the big, American healthcare system that I think is terribly broken, and
Mm.
I'm less optimistic that we can actually fix that. If you look at what President Obama tried to do with the Affordable Care Act, that was kind of nibbling around the edges, actually. It wasn't even comprehensive reform. And what we fought for 10 or 12 years about that.
Mm.
The system, is so broken that it really would take comprehensive, almost starting from scratch kind of reform to be able to fix it. And, I don't think it's a newsflash that we don't do those kind of things very well here in the country anymore.
Yeah.
Whether it's healthcare or immigration or whatever topic you're interested in, we don't really, take things apart and fix them all, anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm not terribly optimistic, given, that it's, 20% of our gross national product is spent on the healthcare industry right now. I don't
Wow.
see, changing that anytime soon. I mean, it's a, it's a, I think it's almost a $5 trillion industry at this point.
Wow. If you, let's say hypothetically, were given a magic wand, or you could be president for an hour or something like that, and you had one or two or three key levers that you could pull that you feel like would make a huge difference, or one or two or three changes, like what would those changes be?
Within healthcare, you mean
Yeah.
generally?
Yeah. 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 Within healthcare specifically, we'll keep it a little
Yeah,
bit more.
yeah.
That it's big enough, but
There's a lot of on the general, but I know that you're asking me about healthcare. One thing is we've got to figure out a way that insurance companies aren't running directing healthcare, and they are right now. They're actually making clinical decisions for you and me. You know, absolutely. And we've got to get them to stop doing that somehow, whether it's legislation, whether it's through the legal system. But they've got to get out of, you cannot let insurance companies dictate the treatment that your doctor gives you. And right now it's happening in a big way in our country. You got to get rid of that. It's just, it's unethical in my view,
yeah.
really to allow that to happen. And it happens. I'm sure no one will be surprised. It happens because the insurance companies don't want to pay for whatever care your doctor thinks you need. But if your doctor wants to give you a treatment, they should be able to do that. That'd be one thing. The other thing that I think really needs changing is the way we treat the nurses. I think that right now the nurse's job, and this got exploited. This really got exploited during COVID. The nurse's job is untenable. We have to come up with federally mandated staffing ratios. Right now, nurses take care of far too many people at once. It's unsafe. And in fact, we're asking them to do something that's undoable. And patients don't get the care they deserve because of it. And I think that that's something that has to happen. And we actually can do something about that. We could mandate a, a maximum number of patients that any one nurse can take care of. I think that would be really important. And the third thing that I would do, you asked me for three, I'll give you three.
Sure.
The third thing that I would do is we've got to stop spending money in the last month of life the way we do. We spend a huge amount of money in the last 30 days of life. We've got to shift that to earlier and make people healthier. We have to quit worrying about the last month, and we have to worry about the whole life cycle from the time somebody's born till the time they grow up to an adult, to middle age, to old age. We've got to keep our people healthier. The American, health, the health of the population, despite the amount of money that we spend on it, is really poor. And that also got revealed during COVID, where the least healthy among us were the people that died, by and large with COVID, not exclusively, but by and large. We've got to deal with important problems like substance abuse and obesity and things of that nature, nutrition, for instance, that we have not invested in. And I think the healthcare system then becomes just a band-aid to try to deal with all the bad habits that we have. And I think we've got to figure out a way to shift that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I thought about this problem like a fair amount, not a ton, and I don't know the ins and outs of the medical industry or the laws or regulations or all about how insurance works. But I have been curious, and I just want to kind of throw this out to see what you think about this. Like, do you think it would be possible for, let's say, an insurance company to still be an insurance company, but essentially like prioritize all of the preventative stuff first, like really find a way to like incentivize or even do like blood work for free, like all of the things that like you need to eventually prevent these diseases, and then kind of I don't know, find a way of traditional insurance on the really expensive back end emergency stuff or whatever. But my thought process is often, if you're able to take care of yourself now, like you said, like you're not going to really get these longer term issues a lot of times. If you're not smoking, you're not going to end up with lung cancer a lot of the time. You still can, right? But your rate is much reduced. And if you're eating healthy, if you don't have obesity, you're not going to need insulin for diabetes because you're taking care of your body's health in different ways, right? So there's so much we can do in the preventative space too. I just a little bit about me, like I was in the kind of the biohacking health and wellness space for quite a while, and so I learned so much about what you could do to take care of yourself. And as somebody even in my 20s, I was investing a lot more into my current health because I figured it's a lot more expensive to do that later if I don't do it now. But I'm curious on your end, like, do you feel like there's a way that we could solve that problem sort of with some sort of insurance model like that? Or is that something we would think we just have to scrap the system from how it is completely?
I think we can. I think you know pretty much in our insurance industry right now, it's one size fits all. You pay a premium, I pay a premium, guy, next door pays a premium. I think we ought to try to financially incentivize people, not to be obese, you know, not to, as a result, develop diabetes, um, to get regular cancer screening, to
Mhm.
get some kind of regular cardiovascular screening. You know, those things can be tiered so that the premiums are less. If I'm a healthy guy, my premium is less than somebody that chooses not to be. What I don't think we can do is take kind of things that are out of the control of an individual and say, well, if you have a cancer family history, we're going to ask
Mm.
more money from you for your insurance premium because of your family history. Well, that person didn't have anything to do with their family history, couldn't influence it. So I think it would have to be carefully done. But I do think there's a way to take the healthiest among us and ask for less premium money.
Very cool. I want to pivot into one of my favorite characters in your novel, which is Allie.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about, where did Allie come from?
Allie reminded me of a lot of the young women I took care of who had a chronic disease and as a result had a world outlook that was different than yours and mine. Very fatalistic in a lot of ways, very resigned to how things were versus constantly trying to make them better, which is what most of us do, me included. I think she also had a certain wisdom, like a lot of the patients I took care of that had chronic diseases. She had a certain wisdom that went well beyond her years. And I think to Joe, she was a teacher. And I think he looked at her as somebody, even though she was half his age, he looked at her as somebody that had parts of it figured out. And it came at an opportune time because Joe was trying to figure out his own stuff at that point, and he happened to run into this young girl who seemed to have some wisdom. And I liked the relationship that they developed. That was of the parts that I wrote in the book. I think that was my favorite part is writing the dialogue between them.
Yeah, I agree. I think the relationship between the two of them is very poignant and striking. I think it's my favorite part of the book as well. And she really almost reminds me of like a ghost of Christmas past kind of thing in a way, or a ghost of Christmas future, right? There's a sense of
Yeah.
almost that she's a spirit kind of quality to her. Um,
That's really insightful. I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, to be frank. But I think that that's really insightful. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think she to your point, she's like this younger woman who has wisdom beyond her years, and there's almost a sense of that she has a wisdom that she like almost too much wisdom for how young she is, like a wisdom that she shouldn't have yet. Um, I'm like tearing up as I think about her. And it's just a very, very beautiful character. So I'm glad that you got to write her, and thank you for introducing me to her. And I'm sure a lot of other people enjoy her as well. Um, have you ever read? By the way, have you ever read Name of the Wind? I'm not sure if you like fantasy at all.
No, I haven't.
No. So it's one of my favorite books. It's by an author named Patrick Rothfuss. His series is called The Kingkiller Chronicles. He's only written two books over the course of like 2.5 decades at this point. They're long books, but they're probably two of the most beautifully well written books I've ever read in my entire life, and two of the only books that I've finished reading immediately and immediately started rereading. And there's a character that she reminds me of who is similar but different, that I think you would really like. Her name's Ari in that book, Auri, but she's similar. Like there's that youthfulness, a wisdom, um, and a sense of tragedy kind of with her as well that I think you'd like.
I'll look into that. No, I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. Even if you don't like fantasy, I think like I said, they're two of the best books that I think I've ever written or read. Um, what were some of the other things that you learned from writing fiction compared to writing memoir?
You know, I think one of the most important lessons was how to create tension. I didn't really understand that, and in memoir, it's somewhat important, but I think in fiction, it's vital. I think without tension, and conflict, you don't have a book. You don't have a
Mhm.
book that anyone wants to read anyway. And I think what I try to do is, propel the story forward using conflict and tension. And that wasn't easy for me. Developing the characters, because I feel like I knew these characters, was not as difficult. But I think trying to create that tension in the story and asking myself, why does somebody want to keep reading it? Why is somebody going to turn the page? You know, that's a nagging kind of question that I didn't anticipate having,
Mm,
but I did have.
yeah.
And I think that that's the hard part of writing fiction is to create that tension where somebody wants to keep turning the pages. I mean, I've had people since the book came out and said, I read it in two sittings, or I stayed up late, or I couldn't put it down, on and on. That's mission accomplished as far as I'm concerned, because
Yeah.
they wanted to keep reading what happened next. And that's all I wanted.
Yeah. No, I relate. I'm actually in process of writing my own memoir right now, and I recently shared um, like the opening chapter with a friend, and she had some feedback, and I like went through it, and I was like, "Oh, but you read the whole thing?" She was like, "Yeah, I like read it all in one sitting." I was like, "Oh, like that's the most important part. Like
Yeah.
the rest of it, there's definitely things to clean up and get better." But I was like, "Oh, you read it?" I was like, "That's awesome." And as a writer, I'm sure you know, it's like it's so that's all you really want. You want somebody to it's worth taking the time to go through. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because I ask myself a lot, does anybody care, what happens next, and why do they care? And it sounds like with your writing, somebody was able to go through all of it in one sitting. They cared what happened next. So I
Yeah.
think that's huge.
Yeah. How did
Congrats.
you thanks, and same to you. How did you learn to create tension? Like, what were some of the things that you started to employ or use as you wrote the book?
I think putting the characters in situations where they had to find their way out of it, was, a constant. Um, with Joe, it was interesting to put him in pickles that he had to kind of work his way out of. And I can't say that I had a formula for that. I guess it was more just thinking, okay, if he had a problem, what would his problem be? And if he had an obstacle to overcome, what would it be? And I think that was sort of the constant question, followed closely by what what would his reaction to be if he had that kind of issue come up. And I think that even as you're writing a memoir, I wrote a memoir. You still have to use some of those techniques, I think, in memoir writing because, in a lot of ways, it ends up reading like a novel if well done.
Mm-hmm.
It reads like a novel. It just happens to be true, and it happens to be small slices of your life or my life that are weaved together, to tell hopefully a story that somebody can say, "Yeah, I can kind of relate to that. That kind of happened to me too." Um, and that's what you're looking for, I think.
Yeah. When you were writing as Joe, were there ever moments where you wrote something and you're like, oh, that's actually me, that's not Joe? Like, how did you find a kind of balance between yourself, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and then probably your own natural insights or curiosities?
Yeah, I think there is some crossover, and I'll tell you where it comes in is in the dialogue. I think what happens is you're trying to speak in somebody else's voice, and sometimes yours enters in, especially if you put a character that's in a hospital. And I have a dialogue that I used in the hospital that I don't really use outside of the hospital, and I have a persona in the hospital that I personally don't have outside of the hospital. I
Hmm.
mean, I used to, I was a pretty, type A personality inside the hospital. I was a perfectionist. I, you know, made sure that I had high expectations for myself and the people around me. Yet when I walked out of the hospital, everybody that I used to hang out with in Palo Alto was like, God, you're such a chill dude, and I was like, well, come to work with me and you might not think that. I think that where David got into Joe probably the most is in the dialogue. I think he said some things that I might have said if I was in a similar situation. That sometimes required, a little um, reality check to make sure that it wasn't just David talking the whole time. It was Joe talking because he would talk that way because that's who he is. And I think I mostly succeeded at that. Although I have to fully admit that some of the times when I was writing the dialogue, my first draft of it was David talking, and I had to kind of check that.
Yeah. When you're writing these types of conflicts where you're putting Joe into something and he has to figure out a way to get out, have you kind of outlined what that looks like ahead of time, or do you go into it? I would say kind of more like Stephen King, where a lot of his writing he does basically maybe has an idea, but then he kind of writes into it and then writes himself out of it, versus and then goes back and kind of fixes it and finds what happened and kind of outlines it from there. Or did you more like outline the process and then kind of like fill in the gaps with writing?
No, I think it was more by the seat of the pants rather than
Mm,
outline. The only thing that I struggled with quite a bit in telling the story was the ending. I rewrote. I had three different endings,
mm,
and I rewrote it. Um, yeah, three different. I mean, I wrote it three different times, and I think where I got bogged down, and I do not have a tendency to get very bogged down in the writing where I can't think of what I want to say, or or I don't know where the story is going. I don't tend to have that problem, but what I did have a problem with was landing this plane.
mm,
And the ending I did struggle with, and I tried three different ways.
Hmm.
Um, and I did kind of test it out. Fortunately, I have a group that a team that I work with, agent, publicist, editor, and I was able to kind of test out three different endings. I couldn't quite decide how to end it. And hopefully the one that I went with resonates, but I struggled a bit with that.
Hmm. What was that, I guess, like for you to have these three different endings? Because that's a very different experience from the audience, right? Where we don't get to pick what happens,
Yeah,
right?
right.
We are given whatever it is. Whereas, like as an author, you get to really choose how this wraps up. Like, what was that process like?
Well, I was kind of frustrating and racking nerve wracking in a way because I really was very clear how I wanted to start the book,
Mm.
and I was happy with how I started the book almost from the first time I wrote it. But the ending, I couldn't decide what I wanted to see happen
Mm-hmm.
on the first hand. On the second hand, what was likely to happen to this
Mm.
guy, and on the third hand, would it be satisfying, to a reader? And that was my last consideration. I mostly wanted to be sure that it was, well, that's what likely would have happened, and that I was happy with it, and I got there eventually.
Mm.
But whenever you have to rewrite an ending of a book, I mean, it was months and months of work. I mean,
Wow.
I'd really finished the book, and then spent a few more months rewriting the ending.
Wow. How how much writing do you do per day when you're writing a book like this?
Yeah, I have a pretty set schedule. I do my writing before lunch, so I'm usually sitting down at around 8 o'clock, and I write until lunchtime. And when I say write, it may not be actual typing, but it might be thinking about where I'm going next with the book. So I do that in the morning, and then after lunch, I generally do my consulting work and
Nice.
put the writing aside until the next day. So my day is pretty much split in half. And there's a lot of professional writers out there that write all day, and I've heard John Grisham, for instance, say he writes from 7 to 11 every day, and he doesn't touch it again the rest of the day, and it's
Hmm.
4 hours and that's it. And I've heard writers say that, and I've heard other ones say they write in the morning and they edit in the afternoon. So I
Hmm.
think everybody does it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think I recently read Stephen King he does like 6 pages per day, so he
Yeah.
doesn't do a time count. He does six. He says kind of cleaned pages by the end of the day. But yeah, for me, I found the time limit taking the pressure off of how much I'm writing also, and just being like, if I'm sitting in front of my computer, I have like kind of standard of this counts as writing,
Yeah.
basically for myself, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's easy to get, you know, lost in other things, and the phone's very attractive when you want to be writing. So,
Yeah, the internet is the problem, for sure. But like I recently, working on the third book right now, and I recently wrote 6,000 words in 2 days,
wow.
and I was quite pleased with that. But I'm not somebody that generally, except for these 2 days, I'm not somebody that counts words and like goes back and says, "Well, I have to do 1,500 a day," because I don't work that way. I think I
Hmm.
have to, write what I can write, and hopefully finish the book in some reasonable amount of time. Um, I have a deadline for this third book, and that's also motivating. For
Hmm.
the first two books I wrote, I didn't really have a deadline, so maybe they took a little longer because of that.
Yeah. What's that been like for you to shift from writing without a deadline to writing with a deadline?
I like it actually. I'll probably go that route from here on out because I think what happens without a deadline is there's a tendency to leave the book for a little while, and it's very difficult to start getting into it if you spend a few days away from the book. So the thing about a deadline is that I personally don't, and I know a lot of authors don't meet the deadlines and they slide and it, goes on and on. But when I say, I try to do this in my life. When I say I'm going to have something by January 1st, I have it by January 1st,
Hmm.
I just try to do that. Maybe that's my father's German influence on me, but I do try to do that if I can, and I fully intend to do it with this book.
Yeah, well, I think you hit a really interesting point about the writing or creative process in general, right? Is that there's, I remember reading a book years ago when I was in acting class that talked about like an artist is never finished; they just stop working on it,
Yeah.
and there's that value, if you will, to the deadline of being like, well, it's done, and I'm going to move on, and there's like a an annoyance with that also, right? Of being like, man, I wish I could make it maybe a little bit better, or a little bit better here, but there's also the fact that like the next one will be better because of what you put into that one. So I'm curious about how you personally wrestle with that own tension of maybe wanting to tweak a couple more things in the book, or like how did you know or get comfortable with the fact that like this was the finished product?
That's difficult because I think every time I read the book, any book that I've written, my first book, I read it or somebody reads it to me. I don't love every sentence in it,
Mm-hmm.
and that's I'm sure true in the second book where I maybe I didn't do that part as well as I could have, but I think there's there's a point you reach when you say, right, for this moment, right now, this is my best effort on it, and that's when it gets turned in. And I, I think I did that with both books, but it's probably never going to stop me from going back and saying, that paragraph wasn't my favorite. Um, and I think that that's common among writers. I've heard writers, even very, New York Times bestseller authors, tell me that they can hardly read the stuff that they wrote early on in their careers, that they actually get physically ill reading it. I'm not to that point, but
Yeah.
I, I I also like to read things that I've written in the past just to see if I'm getting any better at it.
Mm,
I think that's important too.
yeah. How do you judge whether or not you have gotten better? Like where do you like what's your measuring stick for good writing?
It's not just I really go for clear writing. I want it to be clear. I don't want it to be overwritten, and use too many words to say the same thing. I want conciseness. I look for that, but I've been lucky to, that I've had that. I think now I'm kind of looking for some level of sophistication in my thinking,
Mm,
you know, and that part I think I have a ways to go. I want to evolve as a writer in a level of sophistication. You know what I mean? Like I want to be sure that I'm putting thoughtful words on the page, not just clear words on the page, if that makes
mm.
sense.
Yeah.
And I'm still working on that. I think that's gonna be an evolution over time.
How do you develop that?
Practice, I think. Um, Also, I think for me, it's important not to be in a rush when I write. And a tendency is to write as quickly. My tendency is to write as quickly as I can, get the thoughts on the page, and propel. Go forward with the story or whatever I'm writing. And I think I need to slow down a little bit and get more depth to it. That's something I'm working on in this third book. So
Hmm. Yeah. So for you, it's a lot of just slowing down and giving yourself the time to kind of write things a little bit more, not worry so much about being concise right up front.
yeah, I think that's it. I think that that's my. I'm not going to say flaw, but that's what I have to guard against. Is making sure that I'm going slowly. I mean, that's my issue in, my whole life, really. I
Mm,
mean, I think that my first career required that I go really fast.
yeah.
And I think it's something I have to shift to now, is to slow down.
Yeah, I resonate with that a bit. I didn't work in a hospital, but I worked in fine dining for several years,
Yeah.
which is a very fast paced, like
Yes.
high detail oriented
Yes.
and adrenaline rush, etc. And going from that to my first job working in the corporate world was really weird because I needed to fill every moment with something important that I was doing,
Right.
while other people were having conversations at the water cooler, right? And it was like, oh, I get to learn how to like slow down a bit and adjust. Um, I'm wondering, with slowing down, is there anything you do in particular to help you slow down, or do you put anything in place to get yourself to check in, or do you just kind of do that mentally and be like, okay, I'm going a little too fast right now. I'm going to do this, or yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a mindset. I think it's practice. Um, I have a way of writing that I'm sitting by myself. I listen to jazz. I try to get into, that kind of groove, and it's really a mindset. Um, it's you know, I try to, everybody tells you when you draft something, just get it all out, and I don't have that problem. I can get it all out, but I'm now going and really looking at the sentences that I write, much more closely than I did when I first started all of this, several years ago. I'm trying to make every sentence meaningful, and not just getting it down on the page and moving to the next one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Have you experimented with writing with pen and paper or in a journal versus typing, and like the effects on what you end up writing?
Yeah, I really have. I've done quite a bit of that. As a matter of fact, when I first started writing, it was all in tattered journal kind of notebooks, and then I would have to go back and rewrite it or type it into a Word document, which was painful.
Hmm.
What I do though is when I'm first thinking about a project, all of it is in a journal. It's not, when I'm thinking of new things, and for this book, for the one I'm writing,
Hmm.
and a lot of it happens in a journal. And I do think, and I think there's been studies on this, that hand on a paper is a different way of thinking. It's a probably more in depth way of thinking than typing is. And
Yeah.
I think there's been some research around that. I vaguely recall.
Yeah, I remember seeing similar types of things. It definitely, at least when I used to work in neuroscience a bit, and one of the neuroscientists would say that when you hand wrote stuff, it accessed a different part of the brain, basically, that allowed you to, access more of that creativity, right? There's something in the physical act of writing, and I think for myself, because I've had a daily writing practice for I think over a decade, where I do 3 pages of just stream of consciousness writing and just allow myself to kind of declutter and reorganize and that kind of stuff. And I don't really read it or reflect on it much. I just kind of get it out. But one of the things I noticed when I switched from computer to the physical journal was how much slower I had to go when I wrote something down. And the it's interesting when you're typing because you're typing, if you're fast enough, can keep up almost with your thoughts, right? And there were times when I would write and be typing and I would be like, I don't know what to say next. Whereas when I'm writing with a pen and paper, it's like I can, oh shoot, there's 3 paths that I can choose in this moment. Which word am I actually going to write next, or what phrase or sentence am I going to write next? Because that could all change as I'm writing this word because I have to slow down to physically write it out.
Yeah. No, I agree totally with that. I mean, I'm not a very good typist, but you know, fortunately, I don't, that doesn't slow me down. I don't like, type something and say, well, now I forgot what I was going to say. I mean,
Mhm.
fortunately, I don't have that problem, at least not yet.
That's good. Have you ever written with like a fountain pen versus like a normal pen or anything like that?
No, I really haven't. I tend to just scratch with a normal pen, and it's nearly indecipherable. I have this journal sitting over there that is falling apart, so it's probably time to get a new one. But no, I've never tried a fountain pen. Have you?
Yeah. Yeah. I have so I use two different journals for my process. Like
Yeah.
I have the journal that I write to just get the stream of consciousness stuff out, and that's 3 pages. And then I also have a bullet journal that is more organizational, so it's more for me to actually keep notes that I want to reference or plan out my day and that kind of thing. And I use a different pen for each one. So for the writing one, I use a fountain pen, which I got the idea from that from Neil Gaiman. If you're familiar with him,
Oh
he's an
yeah.
author. Yeah, so he in an interview I saw him in, he was talking about fountain pens and how it became this kind of second love that he has with them, and it's been a really fascinating ride because I've found that not only does I would say writing in computer versus a notebook different, but part of what I found is that the instrument that you write with changes
Huh.
how you write.
Yeah.
Um, there's something kind of with a fountain pen I find in particular like very intimate because the nib will over time adjust to how you're writing. And
Hmm.
so you have to change physically how you write. And so there's a kind of a relationship, almost like having a magic wand, if you will. And there's also a sense of it flowing out of the pen, which it literally does. But there is a change to it that's I think is fascinating. That if you try it, I would love to hear how it goes for you because it's been a fascinating experience.
Now I want to try it.
Because you can tell I was in sales before at one point.
Yeah, no, I'll give it a try. Why not? Can't
Yeah,
hurt.
yeah. No, it's fun. Um, very cool. Um, one question I had about what was I going to say? And, oh, that was one I wanted to get into. Um, as a transplant surgeon, both you and Joe deal with a very unique situation in life where you are able to save a life or increase the length of a life at really the cost of someone else's life who has ended. And I'm sure that that's something that you have wrestled with, thought about a lot, dealt with a lot, and experienced in a way that very few people have. And I was wondering if you could just share about I don't know, any insights or thoughts that have come from that experience.
Yeah, the organ donation part of what we do is really an amazing experience. I mean, it's the most selfless act anyone can do. I mean, we take organs from people that have obviously suffered a great trauma and their family has suffered an incredible trauma. And they make the decision that even in that moment, the worst moment of their life, they're going to allow their organs to be used to save up to 8 lives, per
Wow.
person. And I've actually talked to a lot of donor families over the years, both when they donate and then years later, and they all look back on it as one of the most important things that they've ever done, putting it right up there with the birth of their children, in many
Wow.
instances. I am conflicted when I'm carrying around my waiting list when I did that for so many years with names on it and people on it that I care deeply about and I really wanted their organs or their transplant to happen. Or I really wanted that. But I knew that for that to happen, somebody else was going to suffer, a devastating event. So, as much as I would look at my waiting list and hoping that somebody would be able to donate their organs, I was fully cognizant that that was a tragic event for that family,
Mm,
and I think we're going to get to the point one day. I'm pivoting a little bit to the future, but I think we're going to get to a point one day where getting organs from brain dead donors may no longer be required. We may be
mm,
able to either manufacture organs or get them from animals. It's called xenotransplant that you might have seen in the paper recently, but
mm,
I don't I think that'll happen in our lifetime. I don't think it's fantasy to think that that's going to happen.
Hmm. Do you think that's like a 5 year thing, a 10 year thing, 30 year thing?
5 to 10.
Wow.
Yeah, 5 to 10, I would think. I mean, we're already doing it in certain isolated events. The big challenge is going to be to make it more widespread, and
Hmm.
I think it is going to happen in that time frame.
Yeah, very cool. Are there any like weird challenges or considerations with I don't know, getting an organ either manufactured or coming from an animal that's doesn't belong to the human or anything like that?
I think the biggest two are immunologic and infectious disease wise. From an
Hmm.
immunology standpoint, we have to kind of trick the organ into being accepted, or trick the immune system into accepting the organ, and we can do that.
Hmm.
With gene manipulation, genetic manipulation.
Wow.
The infectious disease issue, I think, can also be taken care of before the organ goes into people. You know, pigs might have a different set of infection problems than we have, and we can take care of that, I think, beforehand. But those are the main challenges, I think, in front of us. But I think we've made great progress on both fronts.
Very cool. Um, with that, the other thing that you and Joe both dealt with were instances where you have had to tell somebody that you couldn't save their life like you thought you could. And building a relationship with somebody and believing in the best things, and then getting unfortunate news, seeing their disease escalate to a point where you can't help them anymore. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about what that experience is like.
Yeah, it's probably the hardest part of what I did for so many years. I definitely did did not want my patients to do poorly after the operation. I did want them to live for a long time, but the most devastating part of my transplant experience is when we put somebody on the waiting list and we couldn't even get them to the starting line, which for me was
Mm,
getting the transplant. They just
yeah.
never got a chance. And to tell patients and their families that they can't get a transplant is devastating, because they figure out very quickly that means I'm going to die. And it does mean they're going to die. And, they ask me, does that mean I'm going to die? And I say, yes, it does. And those are the kind of things that, when I had to do that and then go home and try to be, you know, divorced from that whole experience in the hospital, and then suddenly be father and husband,
Mm,
that was really hard for me. And I think it was fairly obvious to my family that I was still at the hospital
yeah.
mentally when that happened.
Yeah. How did you learn to navigate that challenge? Because that's a very direct part of the roller coaster that you're on. You must have been dealing with for a couple of decades of your life. Like, how did you learn to manage that?
I I think I managed it in a way that I allowed me to do my job. I exercised a lot, just to kind of deal with the, tension inside of me. I think that the things that I didn't do as well were being emotionally present all the time at home. I mean, I spent a lot of my emotional bandwidth at the hospital. And so my kids were little and growing up during the time that I was in the hospital. And a lot of the burden, I think, of raising them fell, on my wife. And I was physically there as much as I could, but emotionally, probably not.
Mm,
You know, I would come back from the hospital, and after talking with family members about some of these issues, I would, read a book, be by myself a lot, you
yeah.
know, and one of the reasons I walked out of there was because I realized my kids were now sort of approaching middle school and high school. And, for me to really be a fully present father and husband, I didn't think I was going to be able to do the job and do that.
Hmm.
So that played a big part in my walking out of there in 2016.
Got it. When you left, I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, in another interview, I think you had spoken about going through therapy when you left the clinic. I was wondering, um, what do you think would have maybe been different had you been going through therapy, or were you going through therapy maybe beforehand as well? Like if you'd been going through that while you were acting as a doctor, do you think that would have changed things for you to allow you to navigate your home life a little bit more in the way that you wanted to?
I think so. I think so. I kind of reached this career crisis, if you will, when I was thinking in the last year that I was doing this kind of work that I needed to figure out a way to get out of it. Uh,
Hmm.
I started seeking therapy at about that time, but I had already decided that I was going to get out, but I didn't know exactly how I was going to get out. I really enjoyed talking to therapists. I think it was really important for me. I think it was something that opened my eyes to a lot of things about me that I needed to know. And I think it's going to be something that I do in one fashion or another for the rest of my life. I think it's very much like going to the gym. Um, I go to the gym, I exercise, I do my thing. But I also think talking to a therapist fairly regularly is important for me, just so that I can, you know, emotionally understand what I'm going through. I think that sometimes if you do it by yourself, you don't get a real clear picture of what's going on. If you kind of talk it out, you generally do.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I think it's been really important for me.
What would you say were like the top, I don't know, three things that you really gained from it?
I think one was, I think the most important thing that you can do in therapy, you're honest, and they kind of just, peel back, the onion. And I think it helped me understand why I did the things that I did. What was the motivation? It helped me understand my relationship to my work and what was really going on there and
Hmm.
why was I doing it. Um, it helped me figure out that there was going to have to be a connection that was a closer connection to my family if I was going to be emotionally satisfied. In other words, I was not going to be able to sort of superficially be present at home if things were going to be working out for me, because my family, was very important to me no matter where I was working. Especially as soon as I had kids, I realized that the most important job I had was them. And as a transplant doctor, that's sometimes hard to do because I felt like my job was important. So therapy really helped kind of crystallize all of this for me.
Yeah, you said that one of the things that helped you do was realize why you were, I don't know, had the relationship with work that you did. Are you open to sharing a little bit about what that why was that you discovered?
Yeah, I mean, I think transplant provided and saving people provided a vehicle for me to feel like I was something, you know, like I was worthy. And I think that we're all looking for that validation. And I think that it really gave me validation. Like I was special in a way.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of look for that in my writing as well. I kind of want people to think that what I wrote was significant. It's validation. And, I've talked a lot about in therapy why I need that,
Mm-hmm.
but I need it. And I think that we all need it to some degree or another, and some more than others. But I think that's what we're all looking for. And raising kids has been really interesting because I think kids look for that validation too. And I think you have to give it to them, you know,
Yeah.
no matter what they do, um, give them some sort of validation. So.
Yeah. Was there a way that you were able to meet that need for validation in a healthier way after that? Because I'm sure you had this kind of probably a relationship similar to Joe in that sense of like, well, where am I going to get this validation from if this is gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first year, especially after I left the hospital, I kind of we moved from California back to my hometown in New Orleans, and I think I coached eighth grade basketball during that first year, and I just decided that I was gonna rest and really not dive in feet first to anything. Really, I was writing my first book, Exhale, at the time, but I was writing it in a very um, gentlemanly way. I would write a little bit,
Mm,
put it down, write a little bit. I wasn't even considering myself a writer at that point.
mm,
I, and so it was a very slow kind of writing. I had no pressure to write the book. But during that year, I figured out, I actually made a list, the things that I do well and that I like. And then I put on the other side of the page the things that I do poorly and don't like. And I decided that I'm not going to do anything on that side of the list, but I am going to do the things that I do well and that I like to do. Those are going to be the things that I spent the rest of my life doing.
mm,
And I think that that was important. It was important to take that year to really figure out what I wanted to do next because
mm.
I clearly understood that I was entering a new phase and this was chapter 2 of my life
Yeah.
and the things were going to be different.
Yeah. That's another thing I feel like you and Joe had in common within the book, at least, right? Was sort of part of the benefit is of being a doctor is you get pretty well paid, and so you're in a situation, right, where you can take a year off and think and reflect in those kinds of things. And one of the things I was curious about, because you are definitely very sensitive to um, you know the benefits of privilege as it relates to the transplant world and the medical world and all of these different things. And I was wondering what you thought about privilege as it relates to, I don't know, purpose or being able to take care of the things that actually matter. Because one of the things with Joe is he's very wealthy, even wealthier than probably the vast majority of people coming from the son of a president of an organization. And that's a very actually a pretty prominent part that you were kind of right into the book. It feels like very intentionally is this guy really doesn't have any financial needs at any point in that book, which is not something that a lot of people really deal with normally. And I was just curious if what your thoughts were as it relates to, I don't know, money and privilege and finding your purpose or being able to focus on the things that matter.
Yeah, I did that intentionally in the book because I wanted to make it so that, look, even somebody that started out the way he did with the privilege that he had
Hmm.
can run the ship on the rocks. I mean, there's no guarantee. But I also think that eh, with that privilege comes higher expectations. I think that he anticipated and thought that things were going to go well for him
Hmm.
all the time. I mean, that's how he looked at his life. And he had a lot of reason to think that.
Hmm.
And he was the only one that could screw it up.
Hmm.
And I think I am the son of a doctor, and I grew up in a nice suburban New Orleans environment. And I understand that I started off on third base. I mean, I get that. What you do with it afterwards is up to you. but I feel like the privilege that I had a certain responsibility not to screw it up, not to go backwards. And I think in the novel, I wanted to make sure that people understood, even though he was born into the right family and had money and all that stuff, boy, you could still screw it up. And I'm sure readers understand that. I mean, we see people
Yeah.
in society all the time that have all kind of advantages that end up screwing it up.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that fiction does really well, right? Is like it's this ability to explore nuance in a way. I feel like that you can't really even in, I mean, memoir you can give your thoughts about things and you can share things and you can tell about your experience in a direct way, but there's something that you can talk about more controversial things almost in fiction, right? Because you're able to put somebody in a situation that you can, on one hand be removed on. You can have a character say maybe a challenging idea or thought that isn't politically correct or whatever it is because they're in the situation. And the fiction really allows you to do that, right? To really experience humanity in another person.
I agree. I think having read a lot of fiction in my life, I don't think I really understood fiction until I tried to write it.
Hmm.
Um, the power of it, really,
Yeah.
is what I really understood. I don't know why I didn't understand that, but I didn't until I tried to write it. Um, I'm as impressed with it as you are. That
Yeah.
it's a great vehicle. I mean, it really is. That sounds probably like Captain Obvious, but it really is an amazing thing. I figure I'm going to go back to it. I strongly suspect that my fourth book will be fiction,
Hmm.
because I like it so much, and I think it's so useful,
Hmm.
in delivering messages.
Yeah, no, I agree. If I can give you another book recommendation,
Sure. Yeah.
I'm
Always.
yeah, I'm rereading one of my other favorite fiction books, which is called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Yeah. It's funny.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's
No, go
funny.
ahead.
I was sitting next to somebody on the plane just a couple days ago, and they were reading that book, and I've heard so much about it, but I haven't read it. Are you liking it, or?
I love it. Yeah, it's my second time through it, and I don't know if you have a relationship at all with video games, but video games are very prominent in my life. I'm a big video gamer, and one of the earliest memories I have is playing video games, and it's a story really told through the lens of video games, not in a sense of like a Ready Player One, where it's kind of you're stepping into a fantasy land, but just the way that being immersed in anything changes the way that you think about things,
Right.
right? And they do a really beautiful job of being in a character's thoughts and thinking about them in relationship to a video game of their real life problems, right? And these different kind of personal challenges that they have, and it's a very human story
Yeah.
that I really appreciate. It deals with a lot of complex issues and in a very beautiful way.
Yeah. It's funny. Uh, I you're not gonna well, maybe you will believe this. I haven't I haven't ever, not once, have played a video game. I guess
Yeah.
it's just generational. I'm old, you're young,
Mhm.
Um, but I was wondering about that when I read the little synopsis of that book, whether or not, if you're not a video game person, you know, what will your reaction be to the book? But then again, somebody could say about my book, well, I'm not, I don't care about transplant any, and so,
Mhm.
um, I
Yeah.
assume there's deeper messages in Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, definitely. And that was the same analogy I was going to say. Is like I definitely got a lot out of your book, and have never stepped foot in the
the hospital, yeah,
into as a surgeon or
yeah,
anything like
yeah.
that before.
Well, I'll read that because
Yeah.
I've heard this from a few people that it's an important book, so I'll read it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I kind of feel that way about it too. And yeah, I mean, I would love to, if you want to send me a text message when you do read it, I would love to hear your experience as somebody who has not played video games.
Yeah.
And if you ever play one, let me know, because I also love hearing people's first time playing video games, because it's a different experience, and they've definitely changed a lot since when they first came
Like,
out.
what are the
Yeah.
this is a stupid question, but
No, the
what
stupid
what are
questions.
the video games like? Are they what do you do? Like, what are the what is the like? What is the like? Are you fighting with people? Is it a military kind of thing, or are you?
In the story, or just like in general?
No, in a video game, like
Yeah.
what is the like? Do you have to? Are you basically trying to control somebody, or how does it work? Like, what would be your favorite set of video games?
So, a couple questions in there. So I'll start with like the first one, what I heard, which is like basically what do you do in a video game? And that one is that you do whatever the game is set up to. So, like, if you're playing chess, right? Similarly, like if you're playing chess, the goal of that game is to, you know, get the other person's king, right? That's what you do in that game. The
So
same way
there's
a
a
video,
video game where you're playing chess.
yeah, I mean, they're chess video games, right? For
Okay.
example, but like there are games where you are in the military and your goal is to hunt the other team down and kill them, or your goal is to save somebody, or your goal can be to rescue the princess from Bowser and jump over Goombas and go through obstacles. There's games where you have a portal gun and your job is to go through basically a series of crazy obstacles to get to the end and escape being killed. There are games about ascending to the top of mountains. There are games of having a farm and what it's like to own a farm and live on the land and have a very simple, quaint life. I think it's part of, for me, the beauty of video games is that you can experience so many different things. You can go off on an adventure where you're lost at sea and have to get back and build a home and a life and try to discover new things, or you could be in a very violent situation where your job is to again hunt down and murder people, or somewhere where it's like all interweaving, or
Amazing.
just a whole bunch of different puzzles. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a it's like to me it feels like that part of society that I have really absolutely no experience with, it really is
Yeah.
amazing. I suppose it just skipped me,
Mhm.
I guess my age or something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's an interesting thing, because I mean, basically, and video games came out before I was born, but like really the Nintendo system I think came out the same year I was born, and so it's a weird thing to have been like raised with this new
Yeah.
technology as I grew up too, right? Where that's kind of something unique about, I think, millennials, in that way, is both that and the internet we were sort of raised with as it grew, whereas like Gen Z, they were born after it was already in place,
Yeah.
right? I remember somebody joking to their like Gen Z cousin, I was like, I was born before Google, and they're like, what? How is that a thing? But it's like, it's real, right? Whereas in someone with your generation, like you have a whole lot of your life before any of this stuff has come out,
Yeah,
right?
tons. I mean, tons before, you know, cell phones, tons before the internet, tons,
Mhm.
and I talk to my kids about it. They can't believe that you could possibly survive.
Yeah,
But yeah, a lot of my life without it.
yeah. And then I guess to answer your final question is like kind of where would you start? Video games can run from very, very, very challenging to very, very, very easy. Um, a game that I would recommend that I think is one of the best games that any beginner could really get into, love, find the joy in, still have challenge within its own way, but also teach you a lot about video games in it, would be The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. There's a newer version for the Nintendo Switch, which would be like I recently played it, and that was what I thought a lot about when I played that game, was like, this game would be perfect for anyone who's never touched a game, because it's forgiving, and challenging. There are ways that you can get hints in the game if you get lost and stuck, but it also doesn't just tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a nice balance with that, and it never feels too punishing. That would definitely be my top choice if you're looking to try one out and get started. But then you also have the classics like Mario, and um, any of those games are great. Nintendo's a great place to start, anywhere you want to start with video games.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And please let me know how that goes. I
I'll
would love
try it.
to hear
Yeah,
this.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm up to try anything. So.
Perfect. Um, when you wrote this book, All That Really Matters, like, who did you write it for?
I did not think about, maybe I should, but I didn't think about audience when I wrote it. I got asked a lot, by the marketing folks, of course, um,
Mm-hmm.
after I wrote the book, you know, who is the target audience? I got that a
Mm-hmm.
lot. I don't really have that in mind. You know, the PR folks hate, when you say it, but I think anyone, really. I mean, anybody that really is trying to figure out, what really matters most to them, and I think that's everyone,
Yeah.
can relate to this. I mean, this is not a book that you have to be interested in medicine or transplant or anything else. It's not about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've had plenty of people that are not interested in this subject come up to me and say, "Yeah, I love the book. I didn't know anything about this world, but I loved it anyway." So that's gratifying. But I didn't have a target audience in mind when I wrote it.
Hmm. So, where did the initial idea come from?
I've been thinking about it for a while. I actually thought about it before I even wrote my memoir about these characters. I wanted to write a memoir first because I had just gone through something that I thought was pretty important, and I wanted to, get that down. Um, I've been thinking about these characters for a while. I've been thinking about the character of Joe Bosco for a long time because I
Hmm.
worked with people like him, and I saw a lot of the folks I worked with as great characters. I think the whole thing could be a movie because of the, strong personalities that are involved.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about it for a long time.
Hmm. When you had those ideas or the things that you thought about for a long time, was it stuff that you would kind of write down, just little ideas, or was it something that just kind of appeared in your mind and it kind of just stuck around for you?
Yeah, most of it, I kind of use these little note cards, these 3 by 5 index cards, and I write down scenes on them, and I do it in bullet point form. So it's real, short. And I'll put it up on a bulletin board every time I think of a scene. And then it's just
Hmm.
puzzle moving them around. And I'm doing that now with the book I'm writing. It's the same thing. I have a general direction that I go in, and every time I think of a scene, I write it on a note card and put it on the bulletin board,
Hmm.
and then figure out later where it came from. I'm sure I'm not the only writer that does that, but that
Yeah.
works well for me.
Very cool. Are there any scenes, and I'm asking this with the caveat that I know one of the things with writing is like killing your darlings, right? And
Yeah,
having to
yeah.
exit out. Are there any scenes that you are comfortable sharing about that like didn't make the final cut that you're like, man, I wish this had been in here, but like just didn't quite fit?
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to what we talked about earlier about the ending.
Mm,
Um, Actually, the ending scene that did not make the cut, I liked. Um, as a as a scene, I liked. Whether or not it should have ended the book
mm,
is another matter. But as a scene, I liked, and that's an example of something that I did fall in love with, and I did
mm,
really like, but I had to let it go.
mm,
And I think that that was hard because it wasn't just a regular scene in the middle of the book. It was the final scene, and I I think that with these characters in particular, I might do more with them in the future
mm,
because I have some ideas of other situations that they might find themselves in.
mm. Is there a particular character or characters that you'd want to follow? Would it be like Joe and Kate, or is it like some of the nurses, or?
Yeah, I think it would be Joe and Kate for sure. I think the character of Mary, who is the lead nurse,
Mhm.
is an important one to me. And I think those are the ones that I would really carry on with and probably add new characters to the mix.
Hmm.
would be my guess. And I may do that. I'm still kind of trying to decide, but I may do that.
Very cool. What's your next book about, if you're able to share?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's about identity.
Hmm.
It's going to be non memoir style with a lot more research to it. A lot about religious identity, something that I've struggled with during the course of my life. And I think it's not going to be as narrowly focused as a religion, religious identity book. I think it's going to speak more to identity generally. How do we look at ourselves? How do we describe ourselves to ourselves? And I think that that's going to be the main thrust of it.
Yeah, that was another thing that Joe definitely deals with a bit. And then you kind of mentioned that, I think, in your memoir, and one of the things that you noticed about the people who are on their deathbed, it, and your patients, is that one of the things that really mattered was either their relationships and or their faith.
Yeah.
And what have you learned about, I guess, your own religious identity or your relationship to faith? Like, how has that shifted or changed for you?
Yeah, it's really going to be the subject of this third book. I mean, it's complicated. I came from, a German Jewish Holocaust survivor who turned his back on the religion, on his religion, which was
Mm,
common, among Holocaust survivors. You either adhered more closely to your religion or you turn your back on it.
interesting.
Uh, and I also, my mother was raised Baptist. She's from Selma, Alabama,
Mm,
of civil rights fame, and
mm,
she turned her back on her religion, even though went to church every day growing
mm,
up. When she kind of heard the hypocrisy of what the folks were preaching on Sunday and what the community was doing Monday through Saturday to black folks.
mm,
And so she ended up kind of letting go of her religion. And so we were raised, my sisters and I were raised without any. And it wasn't that big of a deal initially. But then I think as time goes on, if you really can't answer the question, what religion are you?
mm,
It starts to become a little complicated, and as time went on, it became more and more of an issue for me. Working in the hospital, I became very spiritual. I believed in God, and I believed that there was something to religion, and I didn't understand it. And
mm,
so after my father passed away, I was going through my own career crisis, realizing that I had to shift, my professional life. I started really getting interested in religion, and I married a devout Catholic, and I
mm,
started getting interested in Catholicism because my kids were raised with it, and I really enjoyed it. I spent a year every Monday night learning about Catholicism in a church in Palo Alto, and
mm.
it was really a very meaningful experience to me, and it's going to be part about what I write about, that
Yeah.
transformation.
Can you share a little bit more about that? Well, what was it that you found that you loved or really enjoyed about that year, learning about Catholicism?
I think it was the way Catholicism emphasized helping people that were less fortunate than
Mm,
you are, and I think that it was important for me that I always remember that, that how lucky I am, how grateful I should be, how much has been given to me. And I
mm,
think Catholicism really has a focus on helping the poor, helping the people that are less fortunate. And at its best, that's what it does. And I think what it really provided is comfort. I
mm,
think that, at a time when you're sort of wondering, and definitely during that period, I was wondering what was next for me. I think it really provided an anchor that I didn't have otherwise.
mm,
And I saw my wife really take a lot of comfort in her faith, and I wanted that. I just never had it, and I wanted to get it.
Mhm.
And I think that's what I really was interested in.
Do you consider yourself a Catholic now, or do you find like a different resonant with your spirituality?
No, I consider myself Catholic now. I got,
Hmm.
baptized and confirmed, but more than that, you know, I I think Catholicism is something that is wonderful. I really do.
Hmm.
I wasn't, I really didn't have any experience with it until 10 years ago. But it's been an important part of my life and also of our family's life, which I think is makes it even more meaningful to me.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. Um, what was that like when you were not religious at that point and you decided to marry a woman who was very devoutly Catholic? Was that a challenging situation at first?
It was. I mean, her family, wanted to be married in a church, and it wasn't really, possible. So we were married in a hotel, and I resisted formal religion at that point. I certainly didn't have a problem with anybody else that wanted to practice any religion, but I resisted it personally. My father and my mother, to a lesser extent, weren't just without religion, they were sort of anti religion of any sort. And I think that influenced me. You know, I became very skeptical of it, and that changed. And a lot of the change, I think, happened when I saw other people practice it and seeing what it provided for them,
Hmm.
I think was important.
Yeah. No, I agree. For myself personally, I was raised in the Protestant church,
Mhm.
and I have since, like, I don't know, left or evolved away from that. I actually went to a small Christian school in um, Fullerton for university, and I was a philosophy and theology major, and so I did a lot of like exegetical work on the Bible, where it's like you learn the Greek and you go with a lot of
Yeah,
scholarly resources and do a lot of that kind of stuff. And
sure.
I've evolved from my own understanding and my own way of spirituality. So I really appreciate you sharing about how what it brings to you from a different perspective of not having that faith and then going to it, because it's interesting just how I think everyone's spiritual journey changes and shifts in a lot of ways depending on where they start off, right?
For sure.
Um, and depending on what we gained or didn't have as a kid and what we learned that we can gain from something later on. Like, I think one of the things from myself I learned was there's a lot of things that I have had to learn as an adult, that I didn't learn as a kid or as an adolescent, because of my faith. And there's also a lot of things that I gained. I had a lot of spiritual wisdom. I had a lot deeper, complex thoughts and questions about the world and the universe that most of the people my age didn't have, and things that I've wrestled with and understandings that I've was able to gain because of that. Um, but there was a trade off for that also. So it's like there's the ways that those things change us. I think are fascinating. I guess as a question to that with you, like, how do you feel like finding faith later on in your life has changed you or benefited you versus if you had found it earlier?
I think it directed my thinking a little bit about other people.
Hmm.
Um, I think it motivated me to do better, to be better.
Hmm.
Um, I think it made me more cognizant of the people that were less fortunate. I mean, I live in a place, especially now, it was a little more difficult in Palo Alto because, everyone was sort of on third base, if not
Yeah.
on home base.
Right.
um, New Orleans is, I don't know if you've ever had any experience here, but it is truly a melting pot. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm sitting in a nice house, but 2 blocks away from me is not nice. And um, all around me are people that are less fortunate, and I interact with them a lot more here than I did when I was in California. And it just reminds me, that I've got to lend a hand, and we do, but it always makes me think we can do more.
Hmm.
And I think that's what the church has done for me.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up, David. This is a really great conversation. I guess, is there anything that you want to pitch or ask of the audience before we sign off?
No, no, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for very thoughtful questions. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And yeah, if you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and check out David's book, All That Really Matters, and bookstore near you. Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.